My mother didn't want me, at least not at first. Her pregnancy had been a risky affair, with kidney failure threatening her life right up until the moment that I was born, and for many months thereafter. For reasons I've never discovered, at the time of my birth, she had only one functioning kidney. The other kidney had been more or less petrified, and the functioning one was destined to petrify progressively up to the time of her death from congestive heart failure at the age of 57. Her doctor told her that giving birth to me would shorten her life by 10 years. And indeed, when she died, the life expectancy for women was about 67, and she died at 57. That my very existence would be the cause of my mother's early death was a cause of much guilt and anguish during my teens and early adult years. The fact that my mother had survived her own birth was itself an inexplicable mystery. She weighed only a bit over 2.5 pounds when she was born in the Chicago of 1918. No one ever said she had been premature, and it is doubtful that she could have survived as an actual preemie amidst the conditions in which she was born, an upstairs flat being rented by Grandpa and Grandma Simogi. Mom's first crib was an oversized cigar box. Really. Grandma Amelia confirmed the story many times. It is possible that her kidney problem might have been congenital, an odd type of birth defect. Most importantly for this memoir, my mother survived 2 births, her own and mine. When they brought you to me after they had cleaned you up, she often told me, I told them I'd rather have a pork chop. Mom retold that story word for word many times. When I brought my future wife, Anne, to meet her for the first time, she told that story to Anne. She also told Anne what the doctor had said about how my birth would shorten her life. Rejected by my mother at birth, I was reared for the first few months of my life by my Grandma Amelia and her younger sister, my great aunt Lydia. The oval picture near the entrance there is an old cherished picture of my grandmother Amelia. It seems pretty clear in retrospect that I imprinted my grandmother more strongly than my mother. Significantly, Aunt Lydia was my lifelong favorite among my aunts and uncles. Although I loved my mother through all the years of which I have memory, the loss of my grandmother was a much greater sorrow than was the death of my mother. I firmly believe it was a matter of imprinting. By Mom's own account, when she finally took up the role of mother, she was disappointed that she'd had a boy. I always wanted to have a girl, but your father always told me the Zindlers only have boys. To what extent the fact that my mother wanted a girl can explain my sexual orientation is far from clear. It is possible that it did shape my development, but I think it was merely reinforcing innate tendencies that I had acquired in the womb. Let me explain. Many years ago, Scientific American published an astonishing article reporting experiments on hormonal influences determining sexual behavior in rats. It was reported that there were critical periods during pregnancy in which the developing brain can be imprinted by altered levels of sex hormones in the prenatal milieu. When pregnant rats were injected with certain estrogens during critical periods, chromosomally male pups exhibited female behavior after puberty. When testosterone was injected, chromosomally female rats later exhibited male behavior. Now, I make no pretense that I can understand the complex interrelations between the kidneys, the adrenal and pituitary glands, and the sex circuitry of the brain, let alone possible genetic predispositions to homosexuality. However, it seems to me to be likely that my mother's kidney disease must somehow have involved alterations in the normal balance of sex hormones during my fetal development. In any case, I was strongly attracted to the same sex long before I knew what sex was. Among the handful of memories I have from the age of 4, one of them seems highly illustrative. Mom was bathing me in a washtub set in front of the pot-bellied stove in the dining room of the farmhouse. Out of the blue, I announced, "I want to undress a sailor boy or soldier boy." Mom's reply, in retrospect quite surprising, given the fact that she became an atheist several years before she died, was reflexive. "Jesus wouldn't like that." To which I replied, "I'd like to take his clothes off too." I have no memory of the rest of the bath. Then there was that summer afternoon when I was 4 or 5, when I dressed up in Grandma Simogi's dress, and Grandpa Simogi discovered me in flagrante delicto. There ensued one of the few times ever that he displayed even mild displeasure with anything that I might do. He was gentle, and I didn't know what was about to happen. "Come on, let's go show you off at the store." He drove me in his truck to Uncle Harold's country store, gas station, and garage. I had to lift my skirt to get out of the truck without tripping. The scene that followed in the store was one of humiliation, and for reasons that I could only sense but not comprehend. Shame. It was the first time in my life I felt ashamed of myself, and I couldn't understand what I had done that was shameful. I didn't know what shame was, I only felt what it was. There I was, ensconced on a low shelf reserved for piles of newspapers, set immediately under the cash register counter. I remember people laughing. I remember curling up in a fetal position with my back against the wall under the counter. I remember feeling fear, but not knowing what harm was being threatened. I remember pulling up the skirt more tightly about me and wrapping myself into a cocoon. I remember crying. I remember darkness. I don't remember going home. When I was 5 years old, Mom enrolled me in kindergarten at Morton Hill School in Benton Harbor, Michigan. Miss Alice, my teacher, organized a costume party for Halloween. Weeks ahead of time, Mom began work at her sewing machine. She made me a little Bo Peep costume, replete with hoop skirt, wig made of yellow yarn, and a shepherd's crook. It was beautiful. For a week before the party, I dressed up in the costume and paraded around our small bungalow. Mom had a daughter. The Halloween party was the first success of my life. I won first prize for costume. I continued to dress up in that costume until I was too big to get into it. I parted with the wig about a year after that. Although I attended Morton Hill School until the age of 8 in the city, when I was in 3rd grade, summers were spent on the farm. Saturday nights were spent upstairs in the farmhouse in a common room at the top of the stairs. There was a second radio up there, a modern one, and I knew how to tune to WLS from broadcasts from Chicago. I listened to Saturday Night at the Barn Dance, relayed from Grand Ole Opry in Nashville. Every Saturday night, I danced the hoedown, dressed up in one of Grandma Simogi's nightgowns. For a reason I couldn't understand, I never could get the bottom of the gown to stand out like Bo Peep's hoop skirt, no matter how hard I would twirl or pirouette. Marvin. Marvin was 10 years old, and I was 8. Marvin was a big city boy from Chicago. He had come to the farm with his parents to visit my grandparents, along with other guests. Mom, Dad, Teddy, and I had just moved back to the farm from Benton Harbor. I thought Marvin was wonderful. He was very friendly to me, and he could play baseball. Most important of all, he was a big boy, and he was nice to me. We had a great time. I showed him around the farm, took him back to the hillside where Joe Pye weed stalks could be harvested to make spears that we could throw down on any dinosaurs coming up the hill to bite us. His parents decided to spend the night at the farm. I have no idea where they must have stayed, but it was decided that Marvin would sleep in my bed with me. That was neat. We talked and talked after the lights were out, and I felt that I wanted him to be a friend for life. Actually, I wanted him to be more than that. I proposed marriage. When we grow up, we should get married. I want to marry you. Marvin was mildly perplexed. He didn't seem to object to the idea, and he ruminated on my proposal for a while. He thought it over as though weighing the pros and cons. I'd like that too, but I don't think boys are allowed to marry boys. I think they can only marry girls. Why is that? I don't know. I think that's just the way it is. That's a stupid rule. Yeah. Are you sure? Pretty sure. At least we can be best friends. Will you come back from Chicago to visit me again? Yeah, I'd like to. The next day, Marvin and his parents left to go back to Chicago. For 2 years, I awaited the return of Prince Charming. Frequently, I asked Grandpa Frank if he had heard from Marvin's family, always to no avail. Sometimes, I prayed for his family to visit again. Alas, he never returned to lift the spell that was to bring so much misery to my life. Bullies. From first grade onward, I became an irresistible target for bullies. By all accounts, I was effeminate, both physically and behaviorally. Many boys, especially those older than I, simply couldn't resist the urge to push me around or harass me verbally. How I dreaded all the taunts of sissy, taunts that evolved into fairy, queer, and fag as I grew older. It's an open question in medicine whether or not that could have been the initiator of the chronic depression that has plagued me from the age of 16 until the writing of this account. The first bully to make a misery of my life was a second grader who wore cowboy boots. I was in first grade at Morton Hill School, and every day I had to walk home past a small cemetery. The cemetery was separated from the sidewalk by a 4-foot hedge. With increasing frequency, the cowboy would come up behind me as I walked past the cemetery, and he would shove me into the hedge. One day, however, it pushed me into the hedge, just one time too many. I got up off the ground, and I metamorphosed into a windmill. Arms and legs flailing and kicking, I threw myself into the bully like a rotary lawnmower attacking a cabbage. He ran away crying. It was my finest hour, never to be equaled. After we moved back to the farm, the bullying at Stump School, this was the 2-room country school that I went to, from which I graduated from 8th grade at the age of 12. The bullying at Stump School was so bad I didn't dare go outside, whether for recess or during the lunch hour. Even so, sometimes I brought on the persecution myself. One day, as I was walking home from school, I was ambushed by 3 boys I had provoked the previous day after hitting a home run in baseball. Having been taunted by shouts that I was a sissy because I didn't play baseball, I had taken up their challenge. After I hit a home run, I couldn't resist rubbing it in. That's all there is to it? What a stupid game. They threw a lighted firecracker down the back of my neck. I brought it on myself, but it didn't make things any less painful. Snow White's Glass Coffin. Walt Disney's feature-length cartoon film, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, premiered over a year before I was born. Based on a fairy tale collected by Wilhelm and Jakob Grimm, the film became one of the most successful films of the 20th century. It was reissued in 1952, shortly before I would turn 13. I saw it at the Liberty Theater in downtown Benton Harbor, and immediately I became obsessed. That's the only word that accurately describes the mental disorder engendered by the film, with a minor feature of the film, the glass-covered catafalque that served as Snow White's coffin in the dark forest. According to the story, Snow White lay in a poison-induced coma inside the glass enclosure until a handsome prince would find her and kiss her back to life. The image of the glass coffin was instantly imprinted upon my brain, and I can see it yet tonight. As we left the theater, I imagined myself inside a glass coffin set beside a tree at the very specific spot in the woods at the back of our farm where my brother and I had put our makeshift sleeping bags to sleep overnight near our fire pit. I imagined what it would be like to experience summer rain splashing on my glass shield, or the slowly deepening darkness resulting from snow falling over me and accumulating on a wintry afternoon. I fantasized the mice, the squirrels, the rabbits that would sniff at the glass to try to catch my scent. I wondered what a thunderstorm would sound like from within my glassy grave. Of course, it wouldn't really be a grave. It would be an asylum, a place of safety. Like a real grave, no one could hurt me there. I would be safe from bullies. But unlike a real grave, from which no one could ever return, my crystal coffin would be a time capsule. It would be opened when the world had changed, when my prince had come. He would resurrect me. He would love me. The image of my glass coffin in the woods became an idée fixe. It woke me in the night. It greeted me at dawn. It waylaid me without warning during the day. It mattered little what I was doing. I could be at school, working on the farm, or reading at home. The glass asylum ever beckoned to me. It scintillated in my soul. It burnt inside my brain. It mocked my growing awareness that it was madness. Moreover, the God I still believed in would never allow it. It was against the Bible. Over 60 years later, Pastor Fred Phelps of the Westboro Baptist Church would say it all. God hates fags. It was madness. After all, it was a fairy tale. How long could I breathe inside the sepulcher? Wouldn't I soon need to go to the bathroom, even if I were in a coma? Wouldn't I need nourishment? By summer's end and the beginning of my freshman year at Benton Harbor High School, an increasingly scientific mind was trying to make the fantasy less fantastic, less insane. I tried to imagine all sorts of scientific solutions, engineering projects actually, that would allow me to survive in such a birth. Alas, the impossible never became possible, no matter how ingeniously I tried to make it so. Curiously, the idea never crossed my mind that never, in all my life, would a dashing, handsome man ever come to me. Physical non-education. In high school, I was required to take 2 years of gym, although I was allowed to substitute marching band for my second year. The activities we were supposed to carry out in class seemed like a complete waste of time. Mostly it involved moving balls around according to a variety of arbitrary rules. There was nothing I could consider education. Although I would have welcomed training that would have improved my physical condition, things like weight training, treadmills, or swimming, no such useful activities were available. Very quickly, in the first semester, I learned that my grade in gym class would not affect my grade point average. The gym requirement merely had to be satisfactorily completed. As it turned out, the main thing that could be objectively measured to determine completion of the course was how many showers somebody took. Pathologically modest, I dreaded having to undress in the locker room in front of the other boys. The required daily shower was dreaded even more. I always performed my bashful ablutions allegro con fuoco. In fact, while I would be speed bathing, that exact musical direction would be coursing through my mind. I imagined that I was performing Rimsky-Korsakov's Flight of the Bumblebee. Despite that, I quickly developed a strategy for survival. There was another boy in my class who was almost as unathletic as I. He was also in my Latin class. We would report for roll call at the beginning of class, then duck into the locker room as soon as it was feasible to do so. During most of the hour, we would test each other on Latin paradigms. We memorized the 30 forms of the demonstrative pronoun, all the classes of pluperfect subjunctive verbs, and other such essentials of daily life, if one were living in ancient Rome. Somehow we always knew when the organized activities out in the gym were about to come to an end. Then, without looking at each other, we would quickly undress, rush into the shower, and be back in the locker room getting dressed when the coach would appear with his clipboard to record compliance with the shower requirement. As it turned out, I gained more from the gymnasium shower than just a physical education credit. I acquired a never-cured case of athlete's foot. Amazingly, I don't remember a single instance of bullying in gym class, apart from the humiliating way in which the gym coach spoke to me and ordered me around. There was always an inflection in his voice and body language that seemed to reveal a mild contempt. It seemed to indicate he was dealing with someone who didn't really belong in his class. The perpetual dread of being mocked and humiliated kept me in a persistent state of high anxiety whenever I had to enter the gym. The not well-rounded graduate. Given my gymnophobia, it goes without saying that I never went out for sports during my 4 years in high school. I never played basketball, baseball, or football. I never even went out for track or cross country. There was no pool, so I could not be on a swim team, although even that would have been a serious threat to my modesty. And so I went through high school trying, as Aristotle said, to take all knowledge as my province. I took all the hardest courses and pursued extracurricular studies in everything from astronomy to Sanskrit and invertebrate zoology. I won the chemistry medal and would also have won the physics medal if there hadn't been a rule that both medals couldn't go to the same person. I wrote my first full-length book, A Key to the Birds of North America. It turned out that the book was pretty useless, as no birders or ornithologists identify birds with the aid of keys. I graduated with the highest grade point average in the largest class in the history of the school at that time. On top of all this, I was at least a year younger than everyone else in my class. So, with all the things I had to brag about, what was my reward? I was named salutatorian of my class, the second highest honor. Why wasn't I valedictorian? I was stunned, humiliated, and angry when I learned the answer. I consulted a friend on the faculty. He was younger than my teachers and rather new on the faculty. I never took a class from him, and so our friendship was less formal than that even with my favorite teachers. He was a botanist and a true intellectual with whom I shared many interests and values. I asked him if he could find out why I had been passed over for the valedictorian honor. He checked. I learned that the principal did not think I was, quote, well-rounded enough for the honor. I had played no sports and was too lopsided in my achievements. The valedictorian of my class, it so happened, was a star basketball player who was so good a student that he had earned a grade point average just 5 points behind me. It was a bitter pill to swallow, especially because I never would be able to explain why I had been so lopsided in my achievements until tonight. The draft. When I turned 18, I was required to register for the draft. The specter of military life loomed before me like gym class grown to nightmare proportions. I could only imagine what kind of hazing lay before me in basic training. I had finished my first year at Kalamazoo College as a biology chemistry major with a straight A average. I had won the Winifred Peake Jones Prize for Biology. I soon would begin my sophomore year, and I thought I would qualify for an educational deferment from the draft, especially because I was a science major. I cranked up my courage and went to pay a visit to the draft board. To my surprise, the person staffing the office was a woman, a very grandmotherly woman. All my defenses peeled away as we talked. Yes, I did qualify for a science deferment, but it would end upon graduation, and then I would likely be subject to induction into the Army. I confessed my dark secret. To my relief, the lady was not at all judgmental. "You will do more for your country as a scientist than you would do in the Army," she assured me. She gave me a 4F classification, the classification given to men who failed to meet, quote, established physical, mental, or moral standards, unquote. Did she know about Section 158 of the Michigan Criminal Code? Section 158. Any person who shall commit the abominable and detestable crime against nature, either with mankind or with any animal, shall be guilty of a felony, punishable by imprisonment in the state prison, not more than 15 years, or, if such person was at the time of said offense a sexually delinquent person, may be punishable by imprisonment in the state prison for an indeterminate term, the minimum of which shall be 1 day, and the maximum of which shall be life. You don't have to tell anyone what your classification is, she advised. You can say you have a science deferment. After all, you are qualified for that. And that would be the story I would tell whenever anyone asked why I had never been in the Army until tonight. Ferry Lane. Although my first college experience had been a summer studying public speaking and debate at Northwestern University between my junior and senior years of high school, I began college-level studies in earnest at Kalamazoo College. Located in Kalamazoo, Michigan, about 50 miles from my home, Kazoo was and still is a very small, expensive, and exclusive liberal arts college. At the time of my studies there, the school ranked second in the nation of small colleges with respect to the fraction of its graduates completing doctorates in mathematics or science. A startling number of the students had graduated from high school as valedictorians or salutatorians, or had received some significant form of academic honor. Surely it would be a place where I could thrive. Almost everyone there was a serious student, not the type that was likely to be harassing me for not being an all-American jock. I was encouraged in this expectation on the very first day, in the very act of completing registration. I was standing in line at the window where I had to present my scholarships and pay remaining fees. Finally, it was my turn at the window. "What is your name?" the clerk asked. "Frank Zindler." The clerk glanced at a printed list and paused, as if connecting my name to some memory. And smiling, he asked, "Donald Duck and Sanskrit, Zindler?" I nodded, realizing he had read the section in my application where I had to list my many hobbies. He turned to announce my presence to the 3 or 4 other clerks. "Hey, everybody, this is Frank Zindler, the guy that collects Donald Duck comic books and reads Sanskrit poetry." Everyone looked away from their work toward me, waving their welcome. Was I being treated like a hero, even though I had never kicked a ball, bounced a ball, or otherwise abused a defenseless spheroidal object? It sure looked like it. I moved into the freshman men's dormitory, rooming with a high school chum. Our room was at the end of a hallway, a short hallway off the main dormitory. There were just 6 rooms in our wing, 3 rooms on each side of the hallway. Things went all right for about the first month. Then it happened. One afternoon, when I returned from the chemistry lab, I saw a small, crudely lettered sign taped to the archway leading to our hall. Ferry Lane. There was no question who the intended target was. I was devastated, depressed, and demoralized. My illusory honeymoon at Kalamazoo was suddenly over. I had to find out the identity of my tormentor. As already indicated, the majority of the student body was composed of serious students, eggheads according to the vernacular of the 50s. There was, however, a sizable number of students who clearly didn't fit the profile. With no exception of which I ever was aware, all those students were from very wealthy families. In at least some cases, their parents had made enormous donations to the college, probably hoping to increase the probability of their progeny being accepted. It didn't seem to me that any of my fellow eggheads could have put up the sign. It must have been one of the rich guys. I took down the sign and pretended that nothing had happened. I was almost certain, however, that the other guys in my hallway must have seen the sign before I could take it down. Would they too turn against me for bringing notoriety to their hallway? I was pretty sure my roommate wouldn't turn on me, but I wasn't sure about my other hallmates. The next day, again in late afternoon, another sign was posted at the entrance to our hallway. I had to figure out who had done it. It seemed to me that it had to be someone with whom I had at least some interaction. As I considered the rich guys on our floor, one by one, I suddenly flushed in the horror of self-awareness. What if it was someone I had never actually met, but was someone I would have liked to meet? What if it was someone to whom I was attracted, someone who had become aware of my wandering eye, even though I thought I was being extremely careful not to be caught ogling? There was only one guy on the floor who it seemed could have become aware of my attentions. He was 6'4", drop-dead handsome, and reputed to be big man on campus in all senses of the term. I even had dreamt about him several nights during the previous week. Several days went by and another sign appeared. Cautiously, I asked other residents of my hallway who they thought was doing it. To my surprise, 2 of them thought it was indeed the apple of my wandering eye. What to do? What not to do seemed obvious enough. I avoided looking at him as soon as I had reason to think it was he who was coming into view. I affected extreme disinterest. After just a couple more signs on the archway, the harassment stopped. The fall semester came to an end, and the spring semester began. Being the least wealthy student in the dorm, I earned extra money by typing term papers and essays for other students whose college prep educations had not included a course in typing. Mine didn't either. I taught myself one weekend. Impulsively, an editor, I couldn't keep myself from correcting spellings and grammar in the papers I would type. I developed a reputation as someone to hire to improve papers written for a variety of courses. Big man on campus was captain of the golf team. For all I knew, his father may have owned a golf course. Golf and girls, those were his main claim to fame. As the weather got nicer with the approach of spring, he was playing more and more golf. Then, rudely, his English professor assigned a term paper for him to write on a specific topic, Dostoevsky's novel, The Brothers Karamazov. Can you imagine a bigger bother for a serious golfer? Just think how much time that would take away from keeping little white balls out of sand traps and water hazards. It was evening, and I was alone in my dorm room. My roommate was out on a date, and I was typing a paper for someone. There was a muscular knock at the door. I opened the door, and my knees nearly gave out from under me. It was big man on campus. Shod in golf shoes and wearing white shorts and a white polo shirt, he was Adonis come to earth. My heart was pounding. He was so close to me. I feared I was about to faint. Somehow, I invited him in. "I have a proposition for you," he began in a serious tone of voice. I knew instinctively that his proposition was not likely to be the one I was hoping for. Fighting hard to keep the tremolo out of my voice, I answered, "Oh, what is it that you want?" "Well, I've heard you're a good writer. You've corrected term papers, improved them for some of the guys on our floor." "Well, thanks for the compliment. Yeah, I think I've helped some of the guys get better grades. Do you have something for me to edit?" "Well, no. I was wondering how much you'd need to write a whole term paper yourself." He seemed desperate, almost in a panic. My mind defocused into a blur of sexual fantasies, morphing into memories of Jonathan Edwards' Hellfire and Damnation sermons. Could I proposition him to pay me with something other than money? Could I bend him to my will? As soon as that idea raced through my mind, unbearable guilt blocked further pursuit. Forbidden fruit was beckoning so powerfully. I was dizzy. I couldn't even be sure I was speaking coherently. "What's the subject of the paper?" "The Brothers Karamazov. It's got to discuss the philosophical issues in the book." "Did your professor give you any written instructions?" "Yeah, I left them in my room." "Well, I'd need to see more precisely what I'd be in for before I could make a decision." "Okay, I'll go get the paper." Out the door he went, practically running into the main hallway of the dorm. I became short of breath as I tried to assess just how much power I might have over my erstwhile tormentor. Could I? No. Don't even go there. Don't think about it. Big man on campus returned with the written assignment. I studied it and inquired exactly when the paper would have to be turned in. There were 3 weeks before it was due. I consulted my calendar to see what I had to do for my own courses. This isn't an easy topic. It's going to take a lot of time away from my own work. I couldn't do it for less than $100. $100 in 1957 was a lot of money, at least for me. For me, it was outrageous. For a big man on campus, his face brightened as if he was relieved to be getting off so easily. "Great, you got a deal," he said, extending his hand for me to shake. "Well," I replied as I avoided the handshake, I wouldn't require payment until you have the payment, but at the same time, I don't want to be stiffed. I'm not sure if I blushed when I said that word. If I do all that work and you back out at the last minute, I'll need security for the deal. Big man on campus winced as if he feared the deal was falling apart. What kind of security do you want? I've never played golf. I'd like to learn. Let me keep your golf clubs for security. Big man on campus turned pale. He was desperate. Okay, I'll get my golf bag. Bring the Karamazov book, too. He left my room again and quickly returned with his expensive clubs. We shook hands, and he left me alone, wondering what the hell I had just done. I finished typing and picked up the novel. It was big, like all Russian novels. I was faced now with two problems. First of all, from 8th grade on, I have never liked to read novels. Why would one want to read fiction when there are so many nonfiction books to read? Why would one read War and Peace when one could read a well-researched book on Russian history? More to the point, why read the Brothers Karamazov when one could read a textbook on paleobotany or a historical grammar of Greek and Latin? Secondly, there was a very practical problem. I have always been a slow reader, even in English. The reason is that, from early on, I have been a close reader. That is, as I read, I am filing and cross-referencing everything in my mind, tying new knowledge together with things I already know. Even though close reading is not needed when reading fiction, I have never been able to read a novel any faster than a pathology book or a law book. I spent the entire weekend reading the novel and I couldn't quite finish it. That would take several more evenings. I then wrote an outline for a term paper addressing the particular points specified by the English professor. At last I began to write, self-consciously trying to sound like what I thought a literary critic would sound like. I typed out the first pompous page and half of a second page. And then I stopped. My mind was racing. I could be expelled from school for doing this, I told myself. What if this is a setup, entrapment? What if he turns me in? Well, I shook hands on this, another voice reminded me. But he's the bastard who put up that sign. Why? I almost blurted the words out loud. Why should I let him get away with causing me all that embarrassment and grief? He's going to pay for that. Why should I let him take advantage of me? I never finished the second page. I put the project aside and went about taking care of my own assignments. 5 days before the Karamazov paper was due, I returned the golf clubs and the book to the big man on campus. I'm sorry I won't be able to finish this, I lied. I got too busy with my own stuff. Here's an outline for the paper and a page and a half to get you started. Of course, of course I can't charge you anything for this. The outline is pretty detailed. I think you shouldn't have too much trouble filling it out. Big man on campus turned pale despite his suntan. He seemed to be in shock. I don't remember him saying a single word before I opened the door and left his room. I caught sight of him only a few times during the remaining weeks of the semester. I never saw him at all the following semester. Perhaps he was golfing full-time. I never would see him again, except in my dreams. Innocence lost. With the image of big man on campus burnt onto my visual cortex, my first year at Kalamazoo College came to an end. During the spring semester, I had become friends with a graduating senior named Bob. He was a Spanish and linguistics major and had been an assistant in the language lab. I enjoyed practicing my high school Spanish with him. While formally studying German at Kazoo, I didn't want to lose control of Spanish. Bob was even able to instruct me on the differences between Old World Spanish and New World Spanish, so I could try to imitate its various dialects. Bob lived in Milwaukee, and he would have to pass through Benton Harbor on his way home at the end of the semester. I invited him to stop at my home for an overnight stay, the day after I myself got home. My mother prepared supper for the family and my guests, and then I took Bob to see the farm, especially the fish pond and the hillside with its crystal springs. We talked about linguistics and the evolution of Spanish from vulgar Latin. I was enthralled by his command of the subject. Eventually, we returned to the house, and then adjourned to the bedroom I normally shared with my brother Ted. Ted would spend the night in the guest bedroom, so Bob and I could share the same room and continue our discussions after lights out. We continued our academic disquisitions for about half an hour, and then Bob's voice changed. He spoke more softly, almost in a whisper, and then he switched into Spanish. My Spanish wasn't as good as I thought it was, although I had a general idea about what he was saying, actually about what he was confessing. I suggested that we get dressed and continue our conversation outside. Quietly, we slipped out the back door of the house. It was a warm, early June night. The moon was nearly full, and the path through the orchards to the back of the farm took on a surreal, almost fluorescent appearance. We reached the hillside and sat down on a grassy ridge just above one of the springs that flowed out from the hill below. Bob made his confession again in English. I made mine. It was like confessing murder. Actually, of course, the Michigan law allowing for life in prison, the same punishment as that for murder, pertained to homosexual acts, not to homosexuality in and of itself. Until that night, technically, I had not been a criminal deserving life imprisonment. By the time the dawn broke, however, I had become the worst of criminals according to the Michigan Criminal Code. I could spend the rest of my life in prison, no matter how many academic awards and prizes I might win. Even apart from the illegality of what had happened, everything was wrong, terribly wrong. It was utterly at odds with my romantic fantasies. First of all, Bob was very effeminate, an order of magnitude more effeminate than I. Furthermore, I wasn't even slightly attracted to him, especially while Big Man on Campus was still the focus of my fantasies. Secondly, everything seemed dirty and degrading, disgusting. Everything had been clumsy and mechanical. It had been Bob's first experience also. I was enormously relieved when Bob drove off for Milwaukee the next morning. I never wanted to do that again. Right. Less than a week went by before a letter arrived in our mailbox. It was from Bob. He wanted to come back to visit me again. I don't remember specifically what I wrote back. Whatever it was a lie. Some excuse for why his visit would have to be postponed and postponed and postponed. The letters became more frequent, 2 or 3 even per week. I was in a panic. What if Uncle Lloyd, my stepfather, saw one of them and read it? Each letter amplified my sense of guilt and reactivated my panic. I replied to only a few of them. Channeling Tchaikovsky. The summer ended, and I returned to Kalamazoo for what promised to be another year of academic achievement. Bob's letters continued to arrive, now at my Kalamazoo address. Guilt continued to fester in my brain whenever I saw his handwriting. Guilt flared into a purulent wound in my groin whenever I caught sight of a handsome guy who might trigger certain autonomic reflexes. I was powerless to suppress the urges of the flesh, and those urges were becoming more and more powerful. Urges that once had warranted hellfire and eternal torment in an imagined future life now were threatening to precipitate an earthly punishment of a very real testosterone-stuffed body, here, now, in this world. By Halloween, my life had been turned upside down. I was 18 and a half years old by then, and I had completely abandoned religion. I had become an atheist, at least intellectually. Emotionally, I mourned the loss of my invisible friend and the certainties of salvation, of life after death that he had promised. As the duration of daylight began to decrease, the greater gravity of depression began to pull me down. Of course, I knew nothing at the time of the physiology of depression, let alone the physiology underlying the disease that would plague me for the rest of my life. I had to find immediate causes for my misery. I had to find something or someone to blame for my depression. I blamed Bob for my depression. I blamed my mother for wanting me to be a girl. I blamed fate for instilling hopeless desires into me. I blamed big men on campus and all handsome men whose very existence was a torment and a tease. I blamed the state of Michigan for classifying me as a felon, no better than a murderer. I couldn't blame myself for having urges and reflexes against which I was powerless to resist. How could I choose my dreams? How could I be a criminal simply because I had nightly committed crimes in my dreams and wanted to do the same while awake? As the Thanksgiving holiday approached, it became harder and harder to stay attentive in class. It became more and more difficult to finish my assignments. It became impossible to get out of bed, to go to an 8 o'clock class. As a sophomore, I had the privilege of living in a nicer dorm. I was living now in a 3-room suite that I shared with 3 other guys. There were 2 bedrooms, each with twin beds, and a living room in the middle. I shared my room with a 6'6" giant named Pete. My best friend from my freshman year, a German major named Rudy, shared the other bedroom with someone of whom all memory has been erased. In the living room was a couch, 2 leather recliner chairs, and 2 desks. Several of us had record players, the first generation of high-fidelity systems playing 33 1/3 RPM vinyl records. Even though no malice was involved, Pete was as great a problem for me as big men on campus had been. Nearly every night, when he thought I had gone to sleep, he would masturbate beneath his blankets. It nearly drove me insane. I couldn't do anything. I couldn't say anything. I didn't want him to continue, but I didn't want him to stop either. I was held in abject thrall by his nocturnal exercises. Everything seemed more and more to be hopeless. I no longer wanted to live. Although my bouts of depression had begun during my senior year of high school, I could not consider suicide as a reasonable option at that time. Even though I no longer considered myself to be a Wisconsin Synod Lutheran, I still held to the fantasy of life after death and the notion that suicide would doom me for eternity. Now, however, I was an atheist, and there was no longer any barrier, theological or otherwise, to taking steps to shuffle off this mortal coil. Indeed, my newfound atheism had left me with no supernatural purpose, no purpose external to myself, no reason why I should endure such hopeless suffering. I remembered how Grandpa Samogi, when one of our dogs had been hit by a car and severely injured, got a gun and shot it to put it out of its misery. Was I not as worthy as a dog of mercy? It would be several years before I would come to understand that purposes and reasons for living must be created by each person according to circumstances. It was only at the University of Michigan, when I chanced to read Man and His Gods by the renal physiologist Homer W. Smith, that I realized not only that I had to create my own goals and purposes, but that I could create them for myself. Alas, I had not read that book, or its foreword by Albert Einstein, before my roommate left my suite to go for Thanksgiving. to go home for Thanksgiving. But the sad truth of the matter is that the physiological imbalance in my brain would have overpowered the simple logic of man and his gods. The downward spiraling into darkness of neuronal activity in my brain became as ineluctable as the need to sleep when one has been awake for 30 hours. I would have to lie down. I would have to sleep forever. How would I do the deed? The guns I had inherited from my father were back home in Benton Harbor. I had no sleeping pills, but perhaps I had enough money to go out and buy some. But wait, what about Rudy's special medicine? Rudy suffered from some sort of asthma or odd allergy, and he was taking a quasi-experimental medication to prevent paroxysmal episodes. Always melodramatic, Rudy had told me that he had to write down and keep a record of the times at which he took the medication, lest he overdose and die. In retrospect, that doesn't seem likely to have been true, but even so, I believed him at the time. Rudy's parents had arrived to take him home several hours earlier than expected, and Rudy hurriedly packed his things and left with his parents. Originally from Tennessee, his German was pronounced with a decided Southern accent. Rudy's family now lived in Detroit, several hours from Kalamazoo by car. What if... Did Rudy remember to take his medicine with him? I went into his bedroom and looked into the top drawer of his dresser where he kept his record book and medicine. Both the book and the medicine still were there. I couldn't take all of the capsules because Rudy would need enough to cover him until he could get a refill. I took 4 of them and put everything back in his drawer. I got a glass and went out into the hallway, went to the common restroom, and filled the glass with water at a lavatory sink. I swallowed the pills and returned to the room. I had just bought a recording of Tchaikovsky's Last Symphony, his 6th in the key of B minor. It was one of Leonard Bernstein's early recordings, and it was a magnificent performance. There were rumors that he, Bernstein, was gay, a code word used in homosexual circles that wouldn't come into common parlance for another 5 or 6 years. That scuttlebutt lent the recording a particular relevance and significance to my activity. I could not possibly imagine at that dark hour that 20 years later, Bernstein would join Madeleine Murray O'Hair and me as a co-plaintiff in a lawsuit that would go to the Supreme Court of the United States, a case that would ultimately boomerang and force me to end a 20-year career in teaching. As significant as the Bernstein performance might have been, the relevance of Tchaikovsky and his Last Symphony was absolutely paramount. I had read fragments of one of his diaries, and I knew that Tchaikovsky, too, had been gay. Astonishingly, his code for homosexuality was the letter Z. There was much Z at the party. Z was me. I knew he, too, had committed suicide. In fact, he had been forced by others to commit suicide because of his homosexuality. The B Minor Symphony was his farewell to the world, an adieu addressed publicly to the world just 1 week before his death. It seemed the perfect accompaniment to my own exit. I put the record on the turntable, second side up, so the end of the symphony would accompany my own. Then I sat down in one of the recliner chairs, pushed back the reclining to a reclining position, and closed my eyes. The third movement, the first thing to be heard on the second side, is a march scherzo, a profound irony if ever there were one. In a major key, it's not just a march, it's a triumphal march. In German, scherzen, the source of the Italian word scherzo, means to joke or jest. Life's triumphs are just a joke, a cruel joke. All my awards, prizes, scholarships, and childhood achievements meant nothing in the real world, a world in which neither Tchaikovsky nor I could find a place of repose. As the fourth and final movement began, I started to feel ineffably odd. The drug must be starting to take effect, I thought. The movement began in the strings with a plaintive, bittersweet motif. To me, the music was expressing the memory of pain. As horns and bassoon picked up the theme, a never-healed wound reopened. The music began to swell in emotional intensity, with clarinets, bassoons, and lower strings reinforcing violins and violas. As trombones burnished the anguish of a musical prayer, begging surcease of suffering, my mind separated from my body instantly. All at once, I was looking down upon my body from the ceiling. My body was motionless, lifeless, dead. My very soul had become one with the music. Somehow, the music seemed inexorably to be moving downward, ever downward, like an Escher illusion of a square staircase that only leads downward or upward, depending upon how you're looking at it. I perceived the music as moving only downward, with no awareness of any return to a higher pitch from which to descend again. Gradually, as the music and the emotion it conveyed sank deeper and deeper to the bottom of the orchestra, it dragged my mind down with it. Down from the ceiling, spiraling round and around, I drifted closer and closer to the body whence I had emerged. Low strings, tuba, bassoon. Could that be a contrabassoon? I couldn't play a note that low on the bassoon I had borrowed from the music department. The basso profundo voice of the orchestra released the anguished groans of a soul seeping away, draining down into an omni-absorbent oblivion. As my mind hovered mere inches above my hormone-swollen prison, the words Beethoven had written on the score of the last movement of his last quartet flashed before me. Muss es sein? Must it be? Es muss sein. It must be. It must be, yes, it must be. At last, as tubas and lower strings droned a pedal B minor chord, a feeling of warmth came over my body, now enfolding me in its last embrace. My life was bleeding away into a warm, dark bath. And then I awoke in Benton Harbor. I have no memory of how I got there, no memory of what happened to me. I only know that Rudy had realized he left his medicine at school shortly before getting to Detroit. His parents had to turn around and bring him back to get his medications. All memory of everything else has been eradicated, almost certainly suppressed. In fact, I think the memory of Rudy coming back from Detroit was not a memory at all. It's an inference dating to a time long after the fact. I can't ask Rudy to fill in the blanks. He died of hepatitis many years later after being infected by a blood transfusion during surgery. In his 50s, after many years of marriage and becoming the father of a child, Rudy, too, had finally faced the fact that he also was gay. He had separated from his wife on amicable terms and started an all too brief second life with a half Hawaiian partner. 2 lovers, one a man, one a woman, mourned his death.